Welcome back to another edition of the 6Ps podcast. Today's focus is Stephen Johnson's film High Ground and essay writing. When it comes to the basics, we're obviously writing a text response essay, which will hopefully be between 900 and 1200 words by the time we get to the exam at the end of the year. We're obviously going to be writing an essay in response to a specific question that we're answering, and we really want to make sure we're showing off or showcasing a knowledge of the text in this particular essay. You'll always get 2 essay questions as well when it comes to the end of your exam, and hopefully your SAC as well. The structure for an essay is pretty straightforward. It's a contention, a main opinion on the topic with just 3 supporting reasons to go alongside it. And as you explore those reasons or those arguments, that's where you include your evidence from the text to support that, along with your analysis. Now, the general overall structure for a text response essay is an introduction with 3 or 4 main body paragraphs and a conclusion as well. You might find you use TEAL for main body paragraphs in order to structure them. But I'm here to tell you there's no one way and no correct way in order to write an essay. So please use your classroom resources and your teacher feedback to guide you. Something I say a lot is I want students to take ownership of their essay. I don't want the same examples. I don't want things you've memorized. I actually want you to think about the topic and tell me what you think about it, what your interpretation, what your analysis is. And I guess, in a sense, this is a chance for you to show off everything that you know about the text and to be able to do it in response to a topic. Our sample topic for today is this. High Ground illustrates the consequences of conflict between different cultures. Discuss. First thing we're going to do, highlight the key words. We've got consequences, conflict, and different cultures. They're the sort of things that came up for me quickly. Something I'd want to probably think about as well is not just, I guess, the physical conflicts in the film. You've sort of got conflicts in ideologies and the way history is viewed. You've got like inner conflict and inner turmoil of the characters as well. So sometimes when we look at a word like conflict, we think about violence and war. But sometimes it's important to use our reading time just to reflect on it a little bit or consult a dictionary and see if we can't find some added meanings to those key words. Consequences, they're the results or the outcomes. And obviously we've got different cultures as well, which when we're talking about High Ground, pretty clear throughout the film. Something I did want to mention though too is the word illustrates. And perhaps you might want to focus on that phrase illustrates instead of, say, consequences, conflict, and different cultures. Because when you think about it, how does High Ground actually illustrate these consequences? And hopefully when you're thinking about that question, you're thinking about the effects of all the conflict on wider communities. The loss of human life, the eradication of Indigenous culture. I guess you've got the intergenerational aspect and the cyclical oppression that First Nations people have faced as well. And really think about, well, how is this illustrated? It's through that directorial intent and it's through those film techniques. How does Stephen Johnson place the audience to view all of this? And hopefully you've already got a bank of film techniques or cinematic devices or directorial choices. There's a lot of different ways you can say film techniques. But hopefully when you get the question, one of the first things you're thinking about is, what film techniques can I bring into this particular question? When it comes to planning, hopefully by the time it comes to your SAC or your exam, you're using your reading time to do this. If not, if you're starting to write essays now, think about the way you want to plan for it. I think there are 2 ways that you can go about it. There's, I guess, the linear way. So you start by, finding the key words and brainstorming and then formulating a contention, thinking about arguments that are going to support that contention and the evidence that then supports those arguments. But if that's a little bit challenging, sometimes you can sort of flip it around and think about, okay, what evidence do I know really well? What quotations, what film techniques, what symbols do I know really well? and then work out, okay, how can I group these into different arguments? And from there, how can I get those arguments into a nice contention that responds to the topic? Because without good evidence, you're not going to have a strong essay. So you could have a really nice contention with great arguments, really detailed, sophisticated arguments, but if you don't have the evidence to support it, you're probably not going to push towards that high range. So really, sometimes it is important for us to think about the evidence first and then formulating our arguments and contention. Maybe if you haven't already, try both of these methods as a way to plan your practice essays. And then when you go into the SAC or the exam, have that really clear game plan on how you're going to attack the topic then. When formulating a contention, we want to think about answering the question. Do we agree with it? Do we partially agree with it? Are we going to disagree with it? If it's to what extent, then mention sort of to what extent are you going to? Is it to a full extent, to a major extent to some extent? I think sometimes it's best to say to no extent if it's a to what extent question, because sometimes that means we just disregard the question in general. Sort of written a couple of different contentions here that you might want to think about. The film presents the conflict in cultures as a primary instigator of conflict. I've written the word conflict twice in that sentence, so I probably want to reword that. That intercultural conflict involving invasion and bloodshed casts individuals and their communities in a cycle of murder and retribution. The film depicts the destructive personal and communal consequences of intercultural conflict. And obviously your arguments or your reasons are going to support this. So I often say, well, consider adding the word because onto the end of your contention in order to formulate your arguments or think of your arguments. And speaking of arguments, let's say we're going with this contention that intercultural conflict involving invasion and bloodshed casts individuals and their communities into a cycle of murder and retribution. Your arguments or reasons we've gone through this should support your contention. And I'm just thinking about these sort of phrases, violence and the cycle of retribution is one consequence. You've got trauma, you've got sort of segregation, you've got loss of identity or conflict of identity, that self-destruction, and then maybe the inability for reconciliation as well. I should say too, when it comes to formulating arguments, just as I said, really think about, okay, are these going to be three different ideas that I'm discussing, or are they a little bit similar? Sometimes we find ourselves writing very similar ideas, and that means that often we're not really exploring the film in enough detail. We're being a bit narrow in our analysis. Students say to me, can I contradict my opening argument at the end? Can I write a rebuttal? To that I say, look, be really careful, because you don't want to contradict yourself in the essay. But sometimes it's good to go, well, initially in the film, this is presented, and you can have a couple of paragraphs on that. And then your third main body paragraph could be, while this is initially showcased in the film, ultimately the director is really suggesting this. And that way you get around the idea of not completely contradicting yourself. Again, this isn't an easy task, but it's one that does require a little bit of thought into it, particularly if you really want to push towards that high range. With the planning, obviously you do want to plan out your evidence. We want to avoid reusing examples and quotations and film techniques, because you do want to showcase a broad and detailed knowledge of the text. So, we've got our main characters, Travis and Goodchuk. We don't want to be talking about just them in our essay. We want to be bringing in some secondary characters as well. You don't have to bring in all the secondary characters, absolutely not. And this is where it might be an idea to really start honing in and selecting a couple of those secondary characters you're really going to focus on, and I guess build those quotation banks on and those idea banks on. Obviously, if you're writing an essay, like your first or second essay for the unit, definitely use your notes. I wouldn't go in blind, and then gradually start paring back what you're referring to as you get closer towards the SAC or the exam. With the introduction, there's a couple of things we want to do here. The first thing we want to do is introduce the text. Often this is done through maybe like a brief plot description or context information. You want to state your contention and answer the topic, and you definitely want to be bringing the topic into the introduction. You want to outline your arguments, your ideas or reasons in a logical order, and you want to make sure you've got really fluent written expression as well, not being too clunky, but also at the same time, if you want to end or aim for that higher end, really making sure that you've got some nice, complex, sophisticated vocabulary. Now, this is a template, and as I said, there's no one way to write an introduction, and there's no, like, really, some markers like students to start with that context sentence. Others will say, no, they really like the contention as a first sentence. There's other markers that like a more generic sentence about the world and society first. Again, you know, there's no right or wrong way to go about this. Well, I should say there's definitely a wrong way to go about it. There's no one right way to go about it though. And I would definitely be seeking feedback from my teacher, who's going to be marking our SACs, particularly on what they would prefer your structure to be. For me, I like starting with some context information initially, and this is just the sentence study you might use. You know, Stephen Johnson's film High Ground is set, you know, during the Frontier Wars. ... Sentence 2, I like to state my contention using those keywords from the essay topic, or perhaps maybe using some synonyms as well to show I'm not exactly just copying what's written in the question. And then maybe I might want to use my next couple of sentences to outline my arguments. It might be one sentence, it might be a couple, and there's even that sort of that optional final sentence where you comment on the main message of the film and what the director is endorsing. You don't have to do that, but something that sometimes works for essays, I find. Let's look at example 1. It's a mid-range response. Stephen Johnson's film High Ground traces the story of witnesses to violence and atrocity. Throughout the text, individuals from both cultures make decisions which end up in significant consequences for individuals and their communities. The cyclical and intergenerational violence and trauma, along with the loss of culture and identity, are explored by Johnson as resulting from a clash in culture. Ultimately, the text suggests the reconciliation is impossible due to the power imbalance between the cultures. Look, they've definitely responded to the topic. They've outlined their ideas here as well. They've done a really good job here, I think, of being really direct in terms of outlining their contention and arguments. The first sentence is a little bit simplistic. Perhaps we could add some more context detail. I really like using phrases like Frontier Wars particularly to showcase my knowledge of the context. But from reading this, I've got an idea about what their contention is and what their arguments are going to be. Vocabulary is pretty good, but again, we could look to maybe be a little bit more sophisticated in certain areas, but you know, nothing that I would be too concerned about. Look at the second example. Hopefully what you'll find is it's a little bit longer. Again, length for an introduction isn't sort of something I'd be too worried about, as long as we've got our main information involved, as long as we go into a little bit of detail. Conflict has been omnipresent throughout the course of human history, with it being in our nature to challenge our rival peoples for their own materialistic needs. Delineating the tail end of the frontier wars in a post-World War I Arnhem Land, Stephen Johnson's High Ground depicts the growing tensions between Indigenous Australians and Western colonials, intercultural conflicts of invasion and bloodshed casting individuals and their communities in a vicious cycle of murder and retaliation. The consequences of these events are thoroughly detailed throughout the film, both lone characters and their respective groups experiencing traumatic events and forced segregation that spurred them on to inflict violence to regain their justice. Johnson also highlights the loss of identity experienced by individuals as a result of alienation from those who they originally pledged allegiance to, unable to find belonging in a setting that refuses to tolerate their misaligning ideals. That first sentence is interesting. It's one of those, broader sentences to start an essay. It uses first person as well, which I don't really like, but it's not something that I'm going to jump down their throat and say that's terrible, do it again. What I do like though is some of the context detail and some of the language you're using around that. The vocabulary, hopefully you're finding, is a little bit more sophisticated with this one. But the arguments are pretty clear. We're talking about, trauma, segregation, and loss of identity in our main body paragraphs. Something I probably didn't mention before, but is well worth mentioning. Please don't think there's one specific answer that the examiners want. You can have an essay with two contrasting contentions and they both can get full marks. So this is where please don't feel like, oh, that's the only way I can approach a particular topic, like by outlining the consequences and have 3 sort of consequences as a way to structure an essay for this particular question. That's not it at all. As long as you're responding to the topic and you're, again, highlighting, what Johnson is illustrating or how he's illustrating the conflict through the culture clash. That's the main thing, I guess, with this particular essay. Main body paragraphs is where we need to flesh out each of our arguments. We want to include a range of evidence to showcase a detailed knowledge of the text. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. We want to make sure we're analysing and explaining our evidence and how it strengthens or supports our arguments. And we need to make sure we're always remaining on topic and not going off on a tangent. This is, I guess, a teal structure that you might want to think about using. There's a lot of ease here as well, I should say. Again, my feeling is I'd want to aim for at least 2 examples. You'll notice I've got an expand sentence there as well. And sometimes you might say, write a topic sentence over 2 sentences. There's some sentence starters there for you as well, but we'll go through that in a moment too. But again, even the order of that teal, the ease, really it's up to you. Again, at year 12, I really would like to see at least 2 examples per main body paragraph to really strengthen those arguments and to, I guess, show to the examiner that, you're not bringing up just, say, 1 character, but multiple characters just to reinforce your ideas. There's 3 things you need to do in a topic sentence, I think. The first one is to engage with the topic or the topic's language. So mention phrases or terms from the essay topic itself, and you can use synonyms or antonyms for that if you need to. You need to outline your specific argument or idea for the paragraph. And the third thing is to link it to the text, whether it's Johnson or whether it's, the context or the societal norms. Now, I've got some sentence starters there, and if I had no idea what the essay topic was beforehand and I just want to memorize a couple of phrases, this might be it. Initially, the film explores your first idea. Johnson presents your second argument, and then ultimately high ground examines as my third sort of sentence starter for my topic sentence in my 3rd main body paragraph. Now, again, these are just sort of generic sentences, but maybe they might help you initially when it comes to writing without notes, as sort of, ways to clearly and fluently outline arguments. Again, these are just some topic sentence verbs you might think about using. By no means are these the only 10 verbs you should be using in your topic sentence. There are hundreds of them, but these are ones I found to be really useful, particularly, as I said, when I'm first starting to write essays and I don't really have enough time. Without evidence, there's a lot of things you can use. Quotations, definitely. Embed them fluently. Bring in plenty of quotations. How many per main body paragraph? I would be going at least 2. Again, it's a balancing act. You don't want to have a paragraph full of quotations, but at the same time, you don't want to be summarizing the film too much either. Your film techniques, obviously too, make sure you use your meta language where possible, mentioning, camera angles and lighting, costuming, mise en scène, all those phrases, we want to be trying to use those. You've got your film technique verbs as well. Again, I find sometimes there's markers that don't like specific verbs, like users, but again, experiment around with those, have a think about or get a feel for what your teacher sort of likes. Symbols are good to talk about too, as well as context detail. Being a film techniques, again, is going to be what makes this essay unique, I guess. There's only 2 films out of the 20 texts at year 12. The symbols and context details and quotations, they'll often be in your other texts as well, though, whether it's a play or a novel, whichever your other text you've done this year. You want to avoid broad examples and use specific moments. That first sentence, the presence of wildlife, particularly birds, is prominent throughout the film to show the importance of nature. That's super broad. It could be for a number of different films potentially where there's wildlife and birds. The next sentence probably a little bit better. Johnson employs a peaceful tone in the establishing sequence, with Goodchook and his family living harmoniously among the land and its fauna. The shots ringing out across the landscape are symbolic of the intrusion of white culture upon this land, with Johnson creating a soundscape that transitions from calm to violently loud within seconds to emphasise the harmful and barbaric impact of colonisation. Again, just going into more specifics and a little bit more detail with our evidence. Obviously, we've got film techniques as well. Try and provide context to the scene. Don't just jump into low camera angles are used to show this. Use a specific scene throughout the film. Be explicit in using your meta language, like mention the specific film technique, and always explain why it's used. Remember that every scene, every choice the director has made, and every shot has a purpose. And there's some sentence starters below that you might find useful. And what you'll find is once you get the hang of it, you can then start to experiment with those sentence starters. Something I should say as well is there is some evidence that you find in every essay, and that's okay. There are very common examples that we see all the time. However, there's probably moments in the film that you've got sort of your own unique interpretation on. It's like a little bit special. It's a unique example. Try and bring those into your essay, at least one or two of those into your essay. Your examiner is going to be reading a lot of these essays on high ground. They're going to be reading similar stuff. Anything you can do to pique their interest, and it could just be, a particular symbol that's been missed, or, the shot composition, or maybe even, it could be silence or a close-up or a noise that you haven't heard anyone else analyze. If you can fit it in your essay and it works, please do try and bring it in. Anything that makes your essay stand out, an examiner is going to reward, providing, of course, that it's on topic. Your explanation is important. You've always got to explain or analyze any evidence in relation to your paragraph topic or the essay prompt. Think about this after every example. What does that suggest about the idea, or how does it strengthen the contention of the essay? I think verbs work really well after every single example to make sure we're always explaining. You can consider using Johnson's name and exploring his directorial intent. I always think the author or the director's name works really well, just again to emphasize that you are analyzing. But please avoid repeating your analysis. If you've got two examples and you've got the same analysis for both of them in relation to your topic, there's one of two things that you can do. The first one is obviously try and think of a different example. That way you'll broaden your analysis. The second thing might just be simply to put your two examples together and analysing them at the end, just to avoid repeating yourself. Got another list of verbs here as well. These are explanation verbs. Now, again, not an exhaustive list. Some that maybe you might use initially, and then you might sort of start using some more. I really like illustrates, one of my favourite verbs. I like elucidates. Some people don't like elucidates. Again, experiment with these words. See what your teacher thinks. They're not interchangeable, I should say as well. Just be mindful of that. Some of them have specific meanings, some of them don't. So like elucidates means to make something really clear. Illustrates is more so like to show, I should say. I think directorial intent is really important. Consider the following in regards to high ground. What is Johnson trying to do in the film? Is he trying to highlight the importance of something? Is he trying to reflect on societal values? Is he trying to criticize a behavior or mindset? Is he trying to ridicule or question certain events? Is he trying to warn the audience against something? Is he trying to discourage people from doing something? Or is he trying to convey a certain political message or controversial opinion? Now, we can't know exactly what Johnson is thinking with every single shot, but I guess we can take an educated guess about what certain scenes, about what certain characters, and about certain film techniques, what Johnson is trying to do in making these choices. This is a passage that was popped into the background information video earlier. It's a quote from Stephen Johnson talking about high ground. In yellow, you've got, I guess, the directorial intent. He's trying to highlight the missed opportunity between two cultures. He's trying to challenge accepted notions of Australian settlement. He's trying to explore identity and culture and attempts that were made to preserve and progress culture in the face of an overwhelming threat. He's trying to expose the shameful truth of Australian history. There's so much directorial intent in this particular passage that you might then use in your own essay. And again, you don't have to quote this. You can reword it, you can tweak it, you can paraphrase it. It's up to you. But I think the next page will be really helpful in terms of how do I include this into my essay? Well, after your example, think about what is Johnson promoting, endorsing, celebrating, championing, or supporting through his examples if it's something positive. If it's a negative message he's sending, then the phrasing might be, well, the director is condemning or challenging or critiquing or decrying or denouncing a specific value or action. Again, remember these characters are meant to be a reflection of society at the time and both cultures. So think about, okay, through this example, is Johnson promoting an idea or is he condemning an idea? And try and bring at least one of these sentences into each of your main body paragraphs. With your linking sentence, you just want to connect your paragraph topic back to the essay topic to remind the marker that you are responding to this topic, that you're not simply memorizing something that you've written down before. It is relatively similar to your topic sentence, so consider synonyms and sentence structures if you need to. Said it once, said it twice, said it a million times. Read the question, answer the question. Your linking sentence, again, solidifies in the marker's mind that you are answering that specific question. And remember, your marker could be, this could be the 20th essay that the marker has read in the last hour. You want to remind them at the end of your paragraphs, you are responding to this specific topic. I'm not going to read through these examples because these paragraphs are a little bit longer. So feel free to just pause it. This is, I think, a mid to high range one. Have a read through this. Think about whether it includes enough evidence, whether they've got enough film techniques, and whether they're analysing in enough detail. Now that you've read, I guess, the mid to high range, this is a higher range one. Again, think about those key aspects. We want to make sure we've got, obviously, something I didn't mention before is the clear written expression as well. You want to make sure that your writing is really fluent, nice and easy to read. This is a two-parter, this paragraph. Please don't be fooled by the fact that a longer paragraph isn't necessarily a better paragraph. Again, you do have time conditions, so remember that too. But I'll get you to pause if you want to read through this paragraph. I'll pause it on both sections for you. And part two. Move on to our conclusions. Pretty straightforward. Restate your contention, outline or summarise your arguments, avoid bringing in any new information or evidence, and if you can, finish with the strongest argument or piece of analysis. Something I say about conclusions is you can't gain marks from a conclusion, but you can lose marks from a conclusion if you're not being consistent with your contentions and arguments. Here's an example. This is a mid to high range one. Bookended by two brutal massacres and featuring recurring scenes of violence and graphic imagery. Stephen Johnson's High Ground ultimately offers a tragic picture of how intercultural conflict destroys individuals and their communities. In depicting the violence and segregation in post-colonial Australia, Johnson challenges individuals blinded by their culture and presents the loss of identity as a tragic outcome of the frontier wars. Yeah, it's pretty solid, does the job, ticks the box, move on. If you rush for time, please don't devote more than 5, maybe 2 minutes to a conclusion. Finish off your last main body paragraph, and then a 1 to 2 sentence conclusion is fine. You shouldn't have to think too much about it. Just contention arguments, get out of there. Obviously, we're looking for formal writing and a formal tone in our writing. So we do want to write in third person. Sort of said before in one of those examples, there was some use of our, which again, you're not going to get punished for that too much, but don't overuse that. You definitely want to disassociate yourself from the audience of this film, and definitely no I or my. We want to avoid judgments, so we're analysing, not evaluating. So, don't try and say Johnson does something really well or really masterfully. We want to avoid that. It's what he does and why he does it. Use active voice, not passive voice. So Kutchuk's experiences are showcased rather than the experiences of Kutchuk are showcased. Avoid slang terms or using cliches or contractions. Contractions are like won't, shouldn't, so forth. We use them for speaking, but for writing, we want the full words. And use connectives. I find connectives are really useful if I'm stuck, moving from one thing to the next. Additionally, furthermore, as a result, in doing so, thus, here, they're really good, especially when we're first starting to write our essays and we're still getting a hang of it. We're still trying to get the hang of it. Once we become maybe a little bit more, confident with our writing, we can maybe not use these so much. But again, I think they're really good just to signpost where you're going to, so the examiner or the marker sort of knows where you're going and connecting you and your ideas together. Be concise. This is something that comes up a lot. Please consider removing the following phrases or variations of. An example of this scene is when. The director uses many film techniques to show this. Or there are many examples that show the consequences of violence. One of those is, I think the phrasing I go with is avoid introducing your examples. Just get straight into it. Rather than an example of this is when, just go no when and get straight into it. Or the director employs. A phrase like the director uses many film techniques to show this. That's in every film. Of course, the director is going to use many film techniques. It's sort of like a waste of space or a waste of words. You can be more direct and mention specific film techniques that the director has used. There are some banned terms here. Avoid I, my, or us, or we. Avoid the word essay, like this essay will. No, we don't want to do that. Avoid the word theme as well. A key theme in the film is this. Again, it's a little bit too explicit. We want to avoid that. The word thing is very simplistic. Is it an aspect or a factor? Is it a trait or characteristic? Be specific with that. Words like good or bad, again, are pretty simple. Are they positive? Are they optimistic? Are they negative? Are they difficult or challenging? Similar to the word essay, don't use the word contention. My contention is. The word quote, a quote to show this is. Don't do that. Just use the character's name. Kutchuk says, bang, or Kutchuk states, get into it. Avoid contractions. I would avoid asking questions in an essay. I think the purpose of an essay is to answer questions, not to ask questions. So, yeah, avoid question marks. All right, last slide. A couple of final tips. First one, continuously draft and edit your work. Seek feedback from your teachers and your tutors as well. Consider using synonyms and reworking sentence structures to ensure you don't sound too repetitive. Start taking risks now in your first few essays. We want to avoid taking less risks in our SACs and exams. Build your idea in quote banks and look for unique examples where you can. And look at a range of different topics. Get a gauge on which ideas and evidence is flexible. Please don't write on just essays to do with violence. You might not get that idea in the exam. So look at different ideas. Remember, you can connect violence to all the other themes as well. So please don't limit yourself to topics on one particular theme. But that's all for now. I think we're going to be back pretty soon with a sample essay from High Ground that we're going to read over. Any questions, get in contact 6pspodcast@gmail.com. All the best with the essay writing.